This machine here is the Razertip SS D10, and it says 10 amp detail burning system, and it is a beautiful machine. I really do enjoy the Razertip, and I want to tell you some of the pros and cons about using this tool and show you a little bit about how it burns.
Hey Pyro, I'm Janny Lisenby, founder of BurnSavvy.com and your Pyro professor, and I'm here to help you burn like a boss.
If you guys have never used one of these, you turn this on right there, and then you can flip between using this wire, which attaches to this pen, or this wire, which attaches to this pen. So it's fairly self-explanatory. This is the level 10 to 1 when you want to adjust the heat. And I typically burn somewhere between a 6 and a 7. And that's a little bit of a higher heat, but I like to do that because I feel like I can burn a little faster. So first of all, with this tool, you have a dual burner, which is probably one of the biggest differences between this one and the SK model. Now the Razertip SK and the SS D10 both use the same power unit, so their heat levels are going to burn the same also. And this one has 2 places, these little plastic clips. Sometimes I felt like they were a little flimsy, but they have held up very well. And so not as flimsy as I thought, which is nice. Now, something to keep in mind is that these fit in really, really snugly. So trying to get them off is, I have to be very careful, because if I pull right here, it comes apart instead of pulling the pen off. And that's been a bit of a frustration. But if I keep my fingers right up here, then it's not so much of a big deal. However, these connections, that tends to be where the heat gets hottest. And that's true of pretty much any burner. It will get hotter, at least the wire nib burners. It'll get hotter where there are connections. And so where this connects is going to be hotter. If I have to take that apart while it's hot, that's not going to be super comfortable. And so that's why I tend to come down here, but I can't come down here because it comes off and I don't want it to come off. And it does the same thing over here. And I don't take these out. These are also very, very sturdy. It takes, oh, excuse me, a lot of effort for me to get these out. But in a way, that is really nice because you know that you always have a secure connection. So that's something that I really like about the Razertip, is that you always know you have a secure connection, but then you just got to make sure that you're actually holding it in the right spot to pull those connectors so you don't damage your tool. And people always ask me, well, what's the benefit of having 2 cables as opposed to just 1? And honestly, I would say the biggest benefit would be if you use 2 of these nibs, 2 of the pens on a regular basis fairly often. Then it's nice to just keep them both on hand. The pens themselves are thin, very lightweight. If you compare them, the Razertip, Colwood, and Optima, comparatively, if you look at these pens, you will see that the Razertip tends to be a little bit thinner. And if you look at some of the other pens, they get even smaller. This is also a Razertip. All right, pause for just a second. I want to go over the difference between these 2 pens. The one on the left, that thicker pen, that is a heavy-duty pen. The one on the right, the thinner one, that is the standard pen. Now, the difference between the 2 is their capacity to hold up against the heat. So typically when you burn for longer periods of time at a higher heat, those wires tend to get more brittle and the handles of the pen tend to get really hot. And the heavy duty pen is going to actually hold up better because it has a thicker wire, and the handle is not going to get as hot as fast as the standard pen. So that is the biggest difference between the 2. Okay. Back to the review. Okay, and then this one over here is also smaller. And these smaller pens are really nice to hold. They're really comfortable, although for the most part, I'm holding up here, not so much down here, but they are also more lightweight than these 2 other companies, their pens. So that is a feature that I really like. The Razertip pen also gets hotter faster than the Optima or the Colwood, at least in my experience. That's what I have discovered. Now, something about this tool, the red is the heavy duty wire, and then the black one is the regular flexible wire, and the heavy duty wire tends to carry more heat to the pen itself. So that's something to keep in mind. I also really like that these wires tend to be extremely flexible, and they are a little bit lighter weight than, say, the Colwood wires. However, I have discovered that the Colwood actually burns a little bit hotter than the Razertip SS D10. So what this will burn at a level 6-7, the Colwood will burn at a 5-6 in general, at least with my experience. So that is something to keep in mind, is that it doesn't get as hot as the Colwood. However, it is lightweight and in many ways ergonomically friendly. And this is overall a really great machine. Another thing that I really like is you can get adapters. So you can see here that this is this adapter here is helping a Razertip machine be able to use a Colwood pen that plays nicely together, or an Optima pen. So if you are looking to buy a Razertip, but you feel like the nib options are limited, I just want you to know that's not a reason to not get a Razertip. Okay, you can make any nib work with this machine as long as it's got these kind of connectors. So a Tech Chic won't work, a True Art won't work, but a Burnmaster, the Colwood and the Optima will if you have one of these adapters. And vice versa. The Razertip tips will work well with a Colwood or an Optima as long as you have those adapters. And I do find that overall, this is fairly easy to use. The cords are very long. Take this here. Those cords are very long, and that's really nice to be able to, when I have a larger piece that I'm working on, I can actually use either one of these to reach longer distances. The plug-in cord is actually fairly long. I appreciate that too, so that I can actually set it on my table. I don't have to use an extension cord in order to get this up on my table. The only, another, I guess a drawback, I guess it's not really a drawback, but more of something to be cautious of when you have two of the burner pens, is to be careful of the wire. Something that I do, because sometimes my wire tends to get wrapped up or all tangled or whatever, sometimes what I will do is wrap it around my tool once so that I have a shorter cord to work with if that's getting too twisted up, and that tends to help. However, when I have two of these, then I have to be very careful that I'm not turning this over and risking burning one of my wires. So that's something to keep in mind, is just that you have to make sure to keep everything clear of not just one burner, but two nibs here. So that's something to keep in mind, is just the safety aspect. So now, with that said, I'd like to show you how this beauty burns. Now here I have a piece of basswood. It's actually a very thin plank, and it's great for practice. I am using the Razertip ballpoint, and I am burning at a heat level about 6. And the ballpoint is actually very nice to use on the basswood. It burns very, very well. Now, when I am helping people to decide which burner is best for them, because quite honestly, the best burner for you is probably going to be different than it is for me or for another pyrographer, just for the sheer fact that it depends on what you want to use it for. So there are 4 main things that I tell you to look for. One is price. And the Razertip tends to be a little bit more expensive, and this particular one is more of the mid-range price, And so I gave this one $3 symbols because prices change over time. But in general, this one is that mid-range, higher end price point. The next thing I tell you to look for is the ease of use. And because the cords are long and because they are ergonomic, because it has, the high heat and all that kind of stuff, the nibs are fairly easy to change out. I would say that it's easy to use. That is good. The third thing I want you to look for is, does it have reliable heat? And this one does. This one is a very reliable machine. If you turn it up to a level 7, it's probably going to be the same heat at a level 7 every time you turn it on. Not every machine is like that. And I feel like that's something that is very frustrating for people, is when they don't have reliable heat. The next thing is the heat levels. What is the heat capacity? And so I went through first with the spoon shader. That's what you see in the top half of these boxes are the spoon shaders performance at each heat level. And so I turned it on at a heat level 1, and then I burned it, and then a heat level 2, and I burned it, and I went through all the heat levels through level 10. And you can see here that I'm doing it now with a ballpoint. And what I am trying to do is try to keep my pressure the same. I never push on my wood burnings because it's bad for my tool. And I like to work at a high heat. And if I press, that's going to break the wire, especially at a high heat. High heat makes it more delicate. And so I never press hard. I never push. I just let the burner glide across the wood, and I let the heat do the burning for me. And so I'm keeping the pressure about the same. I'm trying to keep my speed about the same. And then in between each heat change, I give it about 2 or 3 seconds to make sure that it has a moment to heat up to the full capacity of that heat level. And then I go ahead and burn across. And that is what you are seeing here. Now, this is actually something that I always recommend to my students that they should be doing with their burners, with each nib, with their heat settings, because this really helps you to get to know your burner and really get to know your tool better. And it helps you to see where you like to burn, because some people don't like the overburn that you can get when you have those higher heats. And if you don't know what overburn is, that's basically the glow that you get around the burn when you're burning at a really high heat. Some people will call it bleeding, because if it were like paint and it bleeds outside the edges and things like that, that's kind of what the heat is doing. The heat is bleeding outside of the burn. And so you get kind of this yellowy glow to it on the outside. Some people really don't like that. And so you can see at what heat level you generally get to before you get to that overburn. And so this is a really good exercise for you to get to know your burner. And you can see here that the different nibs will burn at different heats. At a level 7, you have a lighter burn from the spoon shader than you do from the ballpoint tip. And so it's interesting to see how each nib responds differently, and how each nib responds differently in your hands, because the way you hold it is going to be different than the way I hold it. And so it's interesting to see how these tools respond to the way that you hold it. Now, the last test that I wanted to put this machine up to was the test of bone. Bone burns at a really high heat level, and so I pretty much just ran it through those lower heats until I started to see a mark. And I barely saw it at a 7, but at a level 8, that's where we start to get kind of an okay burn. And then you will see how it burns at a level 9 and a level 10, which is the highest heat for a Razertip SS D10. And what I noticed, first of all, you got to know that bone tends to leave a lot of carbon buildup on the nib, which, if you don't know what carbon buildup is, that's where the ashes are. It's just the burn building up, and that can be really hard to burn through. And so I'm not cleaning this in between each burn. I'm just turning the heat up, and sometimes it's not quite enough to get through that carbon. So sometimes I find myself turning the nib so that I can get a better heat. And this is a ballpoint nib that I am using, which burns at a different level than this nib. This nib is called a small round 2S. And for the most part, this is Razertip's version of the small round shader. And it is a standard pen, and it's actually working fairly well at a lower heat level than the ballpoint. You can see the 7, whereas on the ballpoint you couldn't see the 7's mark, right? At a level 7. And I'm going to show you how it also burns at a level 9 and 10. And I'm just, as I turn it up, you will see that this pen gets redder and redder at the tip. When you are burning that hot, it is extremely important not to use pressure. Very, very important, because you don't want, the wires tend to get brittle at these higher heats. And so you want to make sure that you are not pressing. You are just letting the heat do the work. So you can see here how red hot that is. And this does a decent job at burning bone, at least on the very, very high heats. Now, for burning bone, I would recommend that you use the heavy-duty pens as well as the heavy-duty wire, because both of those will conduct more heat to the pen tip. See how red the nib is right here? And then when I put it down to the bone, see how it darkens? Anytime that you are doing pyrography, you're going to lose a little bit of heat in your wood or your bone or whatever it is that you're using, but it is particularly noticeable in these higher heats. This is why I recommend using a heavy-duty nib for burning bone. So in the end, I would say that the Razertip SS D10 is a medium-high price. It is very easy to use. I think it's awesome. It is extremely reliable. The heat is consistent, and you can see that it has a nice range of gradients, and it also is strong enough to burn high heat items like bone. So the Razertip SS D10 definitely gets my stamp of approval as a professional wood burning artist. It's definitely one of my top favorite machines. If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button and the subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a video from me. You can also find me on Pinterest and Facebook, where my username is the same, @BurnSavvy. And you can find me on Instagram, burn.savvy is my handle there. If you'd like to start taking pyrography courses, you can find them at burnsavvyacademy.com. In the meantime, I hope this was helpful. Keep burning. Later, Pyro.